So, are you single or double? Well over 1,200 videos on my channel, yet apparently I haven't made one specifically about the pros and cons of single-edged blades compared to double-edged. I've touched on it here and there. I've talked about curved versus straight and made some points about single versus double-edged, but there's definitely some more detail to go into. There are some common perspectives on the topic. For example, the opinion that a double-edged sword is more useful in a fight because of the extra edge it gives you, and more edgy equals more better. And on the other hand, you have people who say that the best cutting sword ever made is single-edged. You know what I'm talking about. The falchion, obviously. Or, you know, the katana, I guess. Although there's been a lot of pushback where apparently now anyone who likes a katana is automatically a weeb, according to some people. And the same people also claim that it's the worst sword ever made. So yeah, the internet, being the usual cesspool, is polarized. Whatever, let's just look at some of the advantages and disadvantages that you may get from a single-edged blade. Ask any bladesmith, they'll tell you that a single-edged blade takes less time to make. A double-edged blade doesn't take exactly twice the amount of time necessarily, but obviously it takes longer because grinding an edge and polishing it takes a certain amount of time, so that comes on top of the other shaping that you have to do. The same is true when it comes to maintenance. If you need to resharpen it, there's only one edge to sharpen. Although, because you only have one, you're going to use it more than on a double-edged blade, because that's the only one you have. So it's probably going to dull more quickly and damage more often because it's just on one as opposed to distributed across two edges. But still, it's simpler to deal with overall. Is a single-edged blade sharper? Not by default, no, but can it be? Potentially. Originally, when I recorded this, I went into a long-winded explanation of blade profiles that ended up more confusing than illuminating. To sum it up, imagine we start out with two identical blanks of steel with the same mass, width, and thickness. There are many types of grind to choose from. As long as the primary bevel starts below the center of the blade's cross-section, it doesn't matter if it's single or double-edged. You can simply mirror it. In that case, you lose a bit of material, but both edges should cut as well as the single-edged blade. If you make it single-edged, you have the entire width to gradually taper the material from the primary bevel to the edge bevel. The smoother that transition is, the less force the blade requires to cut through a target. If you make it double-edged, you have up to half the width available for that transition. You can forge the blade to draw it out and increase the width. That also reduces the thickness. A wider, thinner blade cuts significantly better, but is less resistant to bending or breaking. Obviously, you can tweak the blade width, thickness, and type of bevel to favor either cutting power or strength and durability, or you can try to balance them. You can do that regardless of whether it's single or double-edged. So in short, assuming the exact same mass and proportions, a single-edged blade can potentially be more optimized for cutting performance. Another good example to illustrate this is the practical comparison I've done between the Albion Knecht and the Principe, or Principe, I think is how I pronounce it. So those are both excellent cutters, and they're really quite similar. The Principe had a slight edge, but they're very, very close. So one is double-edged, the other is single-edged. How can they be so close? Well, because they have very different blade geometries. The Principe is a lot wider and thinner. The Knecht is a lot more durable. It did not suffer the kind of damage that the Principe did. Between these two, the differences melt away a bit. Is one of them more prone to damage than the other? In theory, it should be the double-edged one because it's otherwise fairly similar. If you did destructive testing on both of these, I'm pretty sure what's more important is going to be the steel quality and the hardness and all that. The shape comes into play, but it's not the only factor. The drawback of a single-edged blade is obviously you don't have the same options for cutting. With this sword, I can double up every angle, basically. You know, the diagonal downward cut, right to left, I can do it like this, or I can do it like that with the false edge, which is a different type of cut, and I can perform a thwart cut from either side. True edge, false edge. Now, it's easy to overstate how much of an advantage that is, because if you think about it, you can do the same thing with the spine, and it's a different attack, basically. You know, it's not a cut, now it's a, you know, it's a blunt bash, basically. This really comes down to differences in technique. The advantage of a thwart cut is that you can do it in a very retracted way. So if somebody gets very close, you can pull it this close and you can strike at a distance that you normally couldn't. But of course, you can still do that like this. Now, it's not necessarily as efficient mechanically. I definitely feel like this is a more powerful cut than this, but it's still available. And you can also adjust in other ways. So if I want to perform a thwart cut, and I want to use my edge rather than my spine, what I can do, instead of doing this, is put my thumb on the other side and do it like this. Basically, that forces the use of the true edge. So mechanically, it's still essentially the same cut. Although having a single edge is simpler for the making and maintenance, it also means that you don't have a backup, so to speak. So if let's say on the battlefield, the sword gets really chewed up and you have a lot of edge damage that eventually makes it significantly less effective, then this is all you got. At that point, it becomes more of a bludgeon almost. With this, you know, this is actually a good example because I tested these against one another to see what kinds of edge damage you would get. Even though this edge and this edge was pretty messed up, if I'm using this, yeah, guess what? I can flip it around and now I have a perfectly good edge ready to go. And then you've got the issue of thrusting power. There are different ways to make a blade thrust better. One is to make it more rigid, another is to give it a profile taper. Like in this case, you see that on the Mainz Gladius as well, for example. Really anything you can do to reduce the resistance against the target, to concentrate more force on less material, essentially, that's all going to help generally. But you can do that either way, with single or double edge, depending on what kind of blade shape you go for. Now, you can argue that a double edged blade thrusts better because in addition to the penetrative force of the point, it also slices. You know, as it goes into the target, the edges work on it as well. So you slice as you stab, basically. This is a very conceptual point. Having done a lot of sword tests, I have to say in practical terms, it's not really that noticeable. I've done tests comparing straight swords versus curved swords in the thrust, and it was not as much of a difference as one would expect. The obvious exception being specialized thrusting blades like rapiers and certain longswords, which are double-edged, but of course you could make a straight, narrow, rigid, single-edged blade just the same. I'm probably going into so much detail that it gets confusing, and that's sort of the point. I'm trying to bring it across how much complexity there is to it, how many options you have in making a blade, and that you have to be very careful with comparing things. You know, like if you wanted to compare these two, and you just say, oh, this is single edge and this is double edge, so we can compare them directly, and any kind of observation you make about the single edged sword is generally true as pros and cons for single-edged ones versus pros and cons for double-edged ones. In this case, I mean, it's pretty obvious that that's not really a direct comparison because they're completely different, you know, different thickness, different width, different length. So any kind of observation you make here is not really going to carry over terribly well. At the bottom line, you're left with something that does not weigh overwhelmingly in favor of one or the other, which is almost like the reason why both existed in history and one of the two is not predominant. I mean, it is in certain areas of the world at certain time periods, people favored one over the other. But if you look at history overall, you see both quite a bit. And it's really a matter of what do you value more? What do you need more in that situation? What's your personal preference? Anyway, this is terribly long. I have to see how to edit it down. Hopefully you found it interesting and not too confusing. Thanks for watching and have a good one, folks. The Principe, or I think you actually pronounce it fuck. No, you don't pronounce it fuck. Hi. It's okay, don't worry. I'm using the lavalier mic, so it shouldn't really pick up any background noise. Can potentially fuck. Can potentially fuck, yes, indeed. I know what I'm talking about. Fuck you.